in general, even grazing cover crops in terms of animal management than I do. But I think I'm bringing a bit of a perspective on the green manure aspect of it and meet some of the goals that you might have in an organic system, and to actually, get the cake, have the cake and eat it too. So those green manures, organic farmers, we know about those benefits. Nitrogen fixation is the biggest one. Lots of other benefits, and I'm not going to go into all of that. The reality is, though, that they cost money. In our own Carmen rotation, we've penciled it out, and it works out to about negative $168 per acre. That's your seed, cost of seeding, land costs, everything, variable costs, fixed costs, all in there. Now, I like to think of that as not as a loss, but as an investment in future, in soil fertility for future crops, but it still is a bit hard to take at the moment. So we started wondering some time ago what would happen if you put some grazing animals into that picture. We know if you hay off a green manure, you're taking off a lot of nutrients, but we thought a grazing animal is a lot different than taking off hay. So just how would that work out nutrient-wise? And what we're seeing is this. This is just one example. This is nitrogen uptake by the crop following either a tilled-in green manure of pea oat, that's the blue bar, versus a grazed green manure, which is the red bar. Now you would expect the animals are taking off a certain amount of nutrients in their live weight gain, right? You would expect you might be robbing a little bit of the nitrogen benefit from the green manure crop, and we're seeing, in fact, the opposite is true. We're getting a little bit more nitrogen available to the next crop. Okay, that's all fine, but are we robbing it from the crop after that? Maybe it's just, that first crop is snapping it up, but we're seeing more long-term effects. The crop after that, fall rye grown the year after that, still basically the same nitrogen uptake in those two crops. This is one example. We've repeated this test over several different experiences, and we always get more or less that same result, where the crops following a grazed green manure get just as much nitrogen benefit as following a tilled green manure. So that's good news, right? So there's you've got your cake, right? You have your your nitrogen benefit to the following crop. Then comes the eating it too part. And when we look at, just on paper, some of the potential live weight gains, if, for example, you've got a 5,000 pound per acre green manure crop, which is very typical for us, we are often above that, up 8,000 with a pea oat green manure. 5,000 is very achievable. Say the animals eat half of that, we've got a fairly conservative feed conversion ratio there, and we're ending up with 175 pounds per acre of live weight gain. So in our back of the envelope sort of calculations, that is bringing our net income in the green manure year up from negative 168 to positive $30 per acre. Not a huge amount, but when you consider you're also investing in 2 years worth of soil nitrogen for following crops, it starts looking pretty good. Question?
Feed conversion ratio.
Yep.
For which animal does it matter?
This is one for beef. There's lots of feed conversion ratios out there, and it varies widely depending on what they're eating. I picked just a fairly conservative one, just to not overinflate numbers accidentally. But yeah, it's just sort of to get a ballpark sort of number. Okay, so $30 an acre in a green manure year. When you put that into the context of a whole rotation, it still looks pretty good. You see the bottom line there. That is a 6-year rotation that has 2 green manures in it. Only one of those is grazed. You can see the net return is up at $144 an acre compared to $111. Positive impact on the whole rotation there. You'll see the top line there, the green manure costs. Yes, it is costing you a bunch of money for probably fencing, watering, that kind of thing. All the costs associated with running livestock on that land, and that's factored into there. But then the income comes from the sale of the livestock products. Okay, so there, you've got your cake, and you can eat it too. Now, how is that all possible, right? It seems in some ways too good to be true. Maybe for those of us who were new to this experience, certainly we had questions about why this worked. And here's a little clue. When we did some green manure grazing again with our PO, we did a couple different stocking rates. What I was calling a light grazing and a heavy grazing, but perhaps it's more accurately described as a heavy grazing and an extra heavy grazing, where we had the ewes on for either just 12 hours on plot or for 24 hours on plot. And this was a pea oat mix that was underseeded with Italian ryegrass. And if any of you have experience with Italian ryegrass, which you probably do, you know that it likes its nitrogen. And if it doesn't have its nitrogen, it will look yellow and pale and it'll complain. So we found that the ryegrass actually survives fairly well under a pea oat mix like that. And then when you graze it, it grows back and some things happen. One of the things that happens, okay, so on your left there is the lighter grazing. On your right is the very heavy grazing. So you can see one thing that can happen is you can kill some plants. The other thing happens, you notice the color difference between those two plots. The plants on the right with the extra heavy grazing had were a lot more better nourished with nitrogen than with the lighter grazing. And that just speaks to the power of an animal's digestive tract to take nitrogen that's in a plant and convert it within a day or two into plant available nitrogen that can go back into another plant in very short order. So that is what is really fueling this almost too good to be true system. It's that nutrient breakdown in the rumen of an animal, excreted very rapidly, and then available for use again immediately, instead of taking weeks or months to break down in the soil. So this kind of idea fits in really well with the concept, which you may have heard of, called ecological intensification, where you use ecological processes to support your goals in farming, and also, you're maintaining those processes and you're building on them, you're harnessing them to achieve your goals. And some papers liken this crop livestock integration, the digestion that happens in an animal, to increasing the metabolism of the system. So you're using nutrients that much more quickly. You're cycling them back into the active part of the nutrient cycle that much more quickly. Okay, the other part that doesn't show up in this picture is the wheat yield the following year was 5 bushels per acre better on the heavy grazed plots than the light ones. Another bit of evidence for that increased nutrient supply to the grazed green manure, and especially with that extra heavy grazing where animals are spending enough time that they are eliminating on that plot. The grazing part of it is important, as in the actual act of eating, but it's the elimination that it really fuels the fertility of the soil and feeds to the plant. Okay, so that's all fine and good, right? The theory, why does it work? But even when we got to the end of these experiments ourselves, we're like, okay, but does this actually work for a farmer? How would you really do this on your farm? Lots of questions there. Which crops can you graze? What about, like, if I'm growing pea oat and I need to maximize my nitrogen fixation and yet graze it before it all goes to seed, I've got like, what, 3 weeks to graze all my green manures? How am I going to spread that over the season? What about, if we are breaking down nutrients, animals are excreting them, are we going to have excess nutrients after grazing? How do I manage the grazing of this? What are the effects on weeds, soil organic matter, soil compaction, soil biological activity? There's still lots of questions there. We by no means have answers to most of these, course, I say we don't have answers to most of these, but a few insights. So these are some of the crops that we have actually grazed with. It's not a very long list that I've presented here. There's a few others we've played around with. Many of you have probably tried more crops than this. But I just threw this together as sort of an example of how you can look at what you have tried and see whether it's working. So I've given them grades, A, B, C, D, down to F, based on a few different criteria. You could add many more columns to this, like forage quality, the window of grazing, all kinds of things. And I'm not going to go into the details of which crop did well, which didn't, but the thing that I think is important to think about if you're doing this for yourself is not to come up with an average out here on the side of all the different scores and, say red clover averages a B or whatever. The point is to look down through those columns and say, or kind of look, I guess, crossing down at the same time, say, okay, this crop or mixture does particularly well in these key points, but really poorly right here. What is another crop that can fill in that niche and complement my grazing system? I think I just throw that out there as a tool for those of you who are thinking about developing grazed green manure systems or grazed cover crop systems and how to choose what crops to include.
Is your variation with rye all the way from A to F depending on the time, that it's more palatable?
Yeah, exactly.
It's younger and the older it gets, the more they don't like it.
Yeah, and the freedom we have as researchers is to try things that we're pretty sure won't work, like putting sheep into a plot of rye that's already headed out and seeing if they'll eat it, and the answer is, of course, no, they won't. Yeah.
And is the black lentil Indian head lentil?
That is Indian head black lentil, yeah. And so again, the sheep ate it eventually, but only when they got really hungry. It doesn't produce a lot of biomass. For us, did not perform nearly as well as some of the other options. And you could also use this in a couple of different ways. First, to build mixtures in one field, and also to set up various plots of land to give yourself sort of a grazing rotation that you can use to fill out your whole season of grazing.
Joanne?
Yes?
What did you mean by flexible? Does that mean?
The idea with that was whether...
Can you repeat the question?
Okay, the question was, what do I mean by flexible? And that is, does it need to be grazed at a particular time, or do you have a lot of options as to when it's grazing? So for example, the pea oat is not very flexible because it won't regrow well after grazing, so we want it to maximize its biomass, then we graze it. Where something like Italian ryegrass gets an A or probably an A+ for that, because you can graze it pretty much any time, it'll regrow, it's great. Was there another question? Okay. Season-long forage supply. This is a little bit of playing around that we have done with options for spreading out the forage supply. Some of them are very straightforward, stuff that anyone can think of. If you are using those spring-seeded green manures that many organic farmers are accustomed to and work well, something as simple as staggering seeding dates, very simple option. And it just spreads out that grazing window. Like we talked about, adding in a grazing-tolerant forage grass into a mixture that will regrow again after grazing. The Italian ryegrass is a great option there. Or actually using a grazing-tolerant legume, like any of the forage legumes that we're accustomed to, or even something like hairy veg that will regrow after grazing if it's managed well. Using fall-seeded crops to fill in that early summer and spring season. So fall rye, seeded the fall before, seeded grazing spring. That opens up some opportunities for growing other cover crops with fall rye, either with fall rye as a grain crop or after a grazed fall rye that's been tilled up and then go into something else. And some overwintering legumes, the forage legumes that we're all familiar with can fill in that gap. And then supplementing with perennial forages in any other gaps that you find is also an option. So just a few pictures. This is where we've been grazing fall rye. It's end of May, but that was a very late spring. Usually the fall rye would be a little more, it would be at this stage a little earlier in the season. So we grazed this, tilled it up, followed that with a pea oat mix, pea oat and some other things mix. That was grazed then in August. And we also tried grazing later. I don't need to show you the picture of when they're grazing in the headed out rye, but we just kind of try to arrange grazing dates with the rye. Another great option with rye, especially when we had a year where it was very dry in fall. The fall rye just barely emerged when the snow finally came. And we had a thin rye stand the next year. Turns out that's perfect for relay cropping in cover crop because it doesn't compete too much with your, the rye doesn't compete too much with your cover crop. So you still get a kind of a mediocre rye yield, and you have this great cover crop underneath. So we took the rye off, harvested it, and then grazed that in October. Another great system. There's Italian ryegrass mixed in with that red clover, although it didn't compete that well, so it doesn't really, it didn't show its face too much. And sweet clover, great option for some June grazing. Hairy vetch, there again, seeded in fall would be a good option for some early summer grazing. Keep in mind that you would want to be grazing it before it gets to this stage because the seeds of hairy vetch are toxic, and so it's just something to keep in mind there. Yes?
Joanne, I saw you had different varieties of hairy vetch at Carmen. Did you try different varieties in terms of grazing and tolerance or no?
So the question is whether we've tried grazing different varieties of hairy vetch, and no, we haven't. And we actually haven't, we have only grazed, the only hairy vetch we've grazed is a variety not stated variety, whatever that is, a line that has come out of the northern US. And we seed it in the spring and then graze it either rotationally or just a once over later in the season. So.
Have you done any work on overwintering vetch, hairy vetch?
The question is, have we done any work on overwintering vetch? And yes, we have, but just not in conjunction with actual grazing. So yeah, we found when you seed it in the spring, it winter kills very consistently. If you seed it kind of midsummer and later, then it overwinters fairly consistently. And several of the named varieties that are out there will do very well here. The Purple Bounty, Purple Prosperity tend to flower and set seed much earlier than some of the other lines that have come out of the northern US. Okay, so this is just one example then of if you've got, say, 3 different fields dedicated to different crops, how each line, different color is a different field, how you could get grazing out of different fields at different times to supply a relatively consistent forage supply to your animals throughout the summer. And there would be many different combinations of this. This is just one example, and I won't even go into the details of it, except that it's more or less what I've just been talking about. Okay, so excess nutrients after grazing. Yes, this is definitely an issue. Sometimes, well, we've often done some soil testing in fall. The dark green bar is a pea oat green manure that was grazed. The light green was not grazed. And so you can see the available nitrogen in fall is very high after the grazed one. And that's a concern because that nitrogen is susceptible to leaching. So we definitely recommend throwing in another, you call it what you want, a catch crop with green manure, cover crop after grazing to soak up those nutrients, and you can even graze that one again. Is there some nutrient tie-up for the following crop? Yes, there certainly can be, especially if you use a cereal to mop up the nitrogen in the fall, and you're going into an early seeded crop in the spring, you may see that your crop does not have enough nitrogen. Including more brassicas or even legumes in that mix will help that. Grazing this second crop will also help that and will again extend your forage supply. On the other option is, of course, like we mentioned with the Italian ryegrass that will grow afterwards to soak up the nitrogen. Some grazing management things. We haven't done a lot of comparing grazing management, but we have seen, for example, with hairy vetch that just the intensity of grazing, you can use it for various goals, either to kill it if you want to create a killed mulch, or to keep it growing, just depending on the intensity of grazing. A little more about rotational grazing of hairy vetch. I'll just say very quickly, we suspect that grazing it rotationally is stimulating nitrogen fixation and creating greater nitrogen uptake in the following crop. That's something we don't really know, but just had that one experiment where that showed up. Yes?
When is the best time to soil test after grazing? Right away, month's time, or how long is that lag?
Right. So the question is, when is the best time to soil test after grazing? Right away or after some time? You would certainly get an idea of what was cycled through immediately and any immediate risk of bleaching if you soil test right away, as in within a couple weeks. By the time, if you were wait to soil test until the late fall, then it's too late to do anything about it. So I guess I, just off the top of my head, would say earlier is probably better. Okay, now just a few things about what didn't work for us. And that makes me think, first of all, well, how on earth do you decide what actually worked or what didn't? Of course, there's biological successes or failures. If a crop just completely fails to establish, that obviously didn't work. Economic success or failure, and that's something we don't look at very much. We leave that to people who are better with the economics or farmers who are actually doing this, but that's certainly something that anyone using the system needs to consider. Cost-benefit balance, even if it's a great productive crop but it's losing money on you, it's maybe not working. And this is, I think, an important one. Did it actually meet our goals? And in organic production, those goals in a green manure year, we have to remember, are the big one, I guess, is nitrogen fixation. Unless you are, like Chris Betcher was talking about earlier, if you caught his talk, unless you are already, for whatever reason, in that state of being in what you call luxury fertility. So nitrogen fixation for us is the primary goal. The season-long forage supply is, of course, super important, and then the yield of the next crop, which is, of course, related to nitrogen fixation and other factors. So just a few things that we've tried that you may or may not want to try on your own farm. For example, seeding hairy vetch in a very dry fall. This is the following spring. There's the hairy vetch plant, in case you missed it, because we almost did when we were looking at the plots. That's after a month of trying to grow. Very poor overwintering. We also seeded some Italian ryegrass in there. The idea was the hairy vetch would grow early, fix a bunch of nitrogen, feed it to the ryegrass. Should be great. Well, the ryegrass totally overtook that plot. So was that a failure? Well, not completely. We still got ryegrass out of it, but it didn't meet our nitrogen fixation goal. So in that way, it was not, it didn't work. Didn't meet our goals. Seeding red clover into weedy stubble in a very dry fall. There's the red clover in case you missed it, because there wasn't a lot there. That's what it looked like in June. But then, we clipped the weeds off, and there was some red clover later on. Also a lot of weeds. Was it worth it? Perhaps. The goal of planting this was to have some early summer grazing, earlier than we would get from a pea oat. When we looked at the biomass production of pea oat, which is the red line compared to the red clover, though, even by the 18th of June, well before the 18th of June, the pea oat was already producing more biomass than that red clover. But you'll notice the red line ends sooner than the blue one, right? The blue one continues. It could have continued much farther into the fall. So if you're looking for more flexible grazing over the year, then maybe it's not such a bad idea after all. So that's where your goals come in. Okay, Italian ryegrass intercropped with red clover as a nitrogen source. And you say, well, where's the red clover? And I would say, exactly, because it just did not thrive in that system. We did alternate rows. You see the ryegrass rows, and there's a little bit of red clover in between. We also tried using winter triticale seeded in that pea oat system instead of Italian ryegrass. It seemed to survive. The plants were there when we grazed that peyote mix in late July, but the plants just did not survive grazing well, and those that did survive just did not thrive afterwards. So we only tried that once. We're not sure what's going on, but it certainly performed much worse than Italian ryegrass in that situation. Grazing that peyote ryegrass mixture, some is not a foolproof system either. When you graze it, this was in a very hot, dry summer, and you can see we've killed a lot of plants there. That ryegrass did not regrow well after grazing the peyote mix. When we've grazed it in kind of wet conditions the following year, we can also kill a lot of plants, although the ones that are left do tend to do well. And when you graze in very, very wet conditions, you can end up with something like that. That's the day after, that's 3 weeks after. We kind of created a bit of a parking lot there with nothing growing. But the next year, we still got a 40 bushel wheat crop off that plot. So was it a failure? Well, we still got our good yield the next year. We got our nitrogen fixation from the peyote that was grazed early. We just didn't get our late season grazing out of the Italian ryegrass. So there's all those little things to weigh when you're deciding what actually worked and what actually didn't. These effects on weeds, organic matter, soil compaction, biological activity, there's very little data. We haven't generated any data on these things. Lots of questions out there, lots of anecdotal evidence that shows that certainly on the organic matter and the biological activity side, that grazing green manures or grazing cover crops is very positive, but we don't yet have a lot of scientific proof behind that. So we're hoping that, well, there is a university, I was going to look up which one, I forget, it's in the US somewhere, that is starting to pick this up. I think they just started a trial this past year, but we would love to see a lot more work done on this. In the meantime, we're relying on you, the farmers, to try things and to tweak the system and to make it fit your operations. Okay, any questions for me specifically before we hand it over to Ian to talk about his experience? Yes?
When you guys say relay cropping, what time period is that exactly?
Okay, so the question is, when I say relay cropping, what time period is it exactly? What's worked well for us here is we plant a fall rye or winter wheat the fall before. We plant our red clover, sweet clover, alfalfa, anything like that, usually in late April or early May, basically as soon as we can get onto the land. And yeah, so there's that sort of overlapping life cycles of the winter cereal and that cover crop. Yes?
Do you have any numbers that we can give our grain farming neighbors? Let's say if you let us grow this crop 1 year and graze it on your land, how much, and you're going to have, so I can try to bargain them on how much he's going to charge me for growing that?
The question was whether we have numbers that, so you're the livestock farmer, right?
Yeah.
That the livestock farmer can present to his grain farmer neighbor about why an integrated system would be beneficial for him as well. I don't have a lot of hard numbers, except that we have seen very good yields following grazed green manures. We could work up some more specific numbers at some point, but I don't have those. So yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, well maybe we should have Ian go ahead, and then hopefully there'll be time for some more general discussion.
All right, well, I'd like to thank you all for taking your time out of your day to attend this presentation. As Joanne said, the green manure year on an organic farm has typically been one that people say, I'm going to lose a lot of money that year and I'm not going to get any benefits. So what we've been looking at is how can we change that into a revenue generator on our farm. You want to take notes? That's okay.
He'll keep us away.
So yeah, this is our farm. We're just on the east side of the Brandon Hills, as Michael said. Been there in our family since 1879. This is just a kind of an overview of the different plots of land we have. I guess it's the yellow and the blue plots are our field crops, and that's where we integrate the green manure grazing. This is just a quote. I was talking to a friend last summer, and he said, and he's doing similar things to what we're doing on a smaller scale. He said, all kinds of people are giving me, who have never done what we're trying to do, are giving us advice on how to do it. And sometimes it is hard as farmers to know where to go and how to do things, but it's really helpful. I think that some of the work that Joanne's been doing, you can get ideas from what they've already done, and so we don't have to make all the same mistakes. So what we've tried so far, we did, one year we spring seeded some fall rye, and for us, we've been looking at how can we extend our grazing season in the fall, so that's kind of what we've been using our green manure year for. Another year we did an oats, rye, vetch, peas mix, and then last year we had a red clover year. It was actually supposed to be a plow down, but I ended up grazing half the field as well. So this was the rye. It was marginally successful, and again, rye on its own, I probably shouldn't have expected a lot without that nitrogen legume in the mix. But we did, we grazed that in the fall of 2013 for a month. We had 85 cow-calf pairs out there, and the gain wasn't that great, but 1.62 pounds a day. On this bunch, we did weigh them in and out, so those are actual gains. Gross 137 an acre. I think that was based on $1.62 a pound calves. So we figured we netted around 45. I guess if all these numbers, it depends on what you plug in for your value of your land and all those kind of things. That's kind of where we thought. So at least, I mean, for me, even if I can break even on that great green manure year, if it's not costing me money, that's what we're looking for. And this was 2014. We did an oat, pea, rye, and vetch mix. And my idea was that the oats and peas would come up first. We'd graze that earlier, and then we'd have the vetch and the rye come back in the fall. I think it would have worked better if our problem was we ended up seeding, I think, about the 6th of June, and then it wasn't ready to graze till late July, and then I left the cattle on too long. And the better way of doing it, either if we could have seeded a little earlier and grazed, say, really hard for about a week in July, and then let the vetch and Italian rye or whatever, or ryegrass in that case, come back, we would have had more available for the fall. So we had them on through August, which in another time I wouldn't do that. But it did turn out okay. We had a 56-acre field. We split the field in half. We had 36 yearlings on one half, and we had 20 pairs and 11 replacements on the other half. When we totaled it all up, and I guess we split it in half, and then we also split those halves into about 5-acre chunks. At the end of the day, we ended up with 111 pounds of beef per acre. So when we worked that back with the numbers we were getting for the beef that year, we ended up about $100 an acre net. So to me, that was a pretty positive outcome. But I also look at our gains really when I look at pounds per acre, there's a lot more room that I think we could improve that. And I guess the other thing, when I look at all these numbers, I'm really humbled, as I've read a few of Joel Salatin's books. Any people here know who Joel Salatin is? A few people. I think the last book I read last year, he was up to grossing $10,000 an acre on basically the similar animals that we've got on our farm, the beef and pasture poultry and those kind of things. So we got a long way to go. But it is neat to say, well, yeah, here's where we can go. We're here, we're doing all right, but yeah, there's other guys that are just blowing us out of the water. So.
Yeah, in a super high population area. Come
Yeah.
on now.
So,
But anyway.
some of the yuppies in Washington DC.
Yeah.
There's things to aspire to.
I don't want to be that high popular.
We're not done yet. Anyway, just to add, I guess, ways that that on a grain farm, ways that you could implement this system. We've got a system of movable troughs, and I think it was in 2009 we got this pasture pipeline plow in, and we put in about 4 miles of pipe. We did have some sponsorship through the Growing Forward program, and that's just changed what we can do on our farm. We've these typical grain fields now they can be pastured, so that's helped a lot. And for other people going forward, if you've got a water source, the 4 miles we put in, we did that in 1 day. Like, it didn't take long at all. And it wasn't, if you spread that cost over 25 to 30 years, it's worth doing them.
But these are with fields that are already fenced, or are you using electric fencing?
Some of both. Most of our fields, like, we've got a perimeter fence around, and then we'll use we use basically all electric now, perimeter and inside. But I'm going to get to that right here. This is a winter picture, but one way for putting it, if you want corner posts kind of thing in a grain field, just temporary. Cordless drill with a good sized bit, and then we use on the right there, you can just see a sucker rod. It's a fiberglass sucker rod. Those work wonderful for electric fences because they don't ground out. So if you're going across the field and you want to put a little bit of a corner in, you can put one of these posts a little more stable than the traditional ones that you just step in. So that's a few ideas, and it doesn't take very long, even to put a half a mile fence in. Hour and a half, like it really doesn't take long. Although it is at a busier time of year, so sometimes it's like, well, I'm trying to hay, and if we don't have kids around, it's getting all this stuff done today sometimes. So I look at some of the guys that are moving like twice a day, and I admire them, but with my, what did Martin say this morning? Labor and time. Yeah. With my labor and time, some days that doesn't fit in. So sometimes, yeah, a 4 or 5 acre chunk for us works better. What we've learned, start grazing sooner rather than later. And I guess there's two ways we could do that. You don't necessarily have to graze that first time. You could bale it and leave the bales out there too, and then have your fall stuff grow up around them. Cattle will eat immature weeds, so don't panic if you got weeds there. But the other thing is, if you can get those cows out sooner when the weeds are small, they'll clip them off. If you let things grow too high, then they're not going to like them, and you're going to have to be prepared to clip the weeds so they won't go to seed. And again, like Joanne said, a thunderstorm can lead to compaction. The fields that we're working on are a clay loam kind of soil, and so if you get I think on the 2014 we had 3 or 4 inches right at the end of August, and we certainly saw that last year. Like, we had compaction issues on that field, and our yields for the wheat weren't as good as we would have liked.
From the pressure of the rain coming down, not
No, I think both. Like the rain being wet and then having animals on that wet ground led to some compaction. Yeah. And this, I guess it's hard to see for you guys, but this is just an example. We've got some thistle issues in the background, so when these guys came out, we just went over that with a swather quick and clipped the tops off the thistles just so they wouldn't go to seed or blow all over the country. I think the thistles are more of an issue, the roots, but your neighbors appreciate if there isn't those thistle head blowing around. Even though Martin says they're only, 5% viable, yeah, the neighbors don't appreciate that. So.
Will the cattle eat the thistle?
They'll eat the thistle, like I said, when they're young. But at this stage, goats would have eaten those. So I mean, that's another thing as organic people. If you could work with somebody that had a herd of sheep or goats, you don't actually need to own them. But if you could find somebody that wouldn't mind throwing some, there's options there as well.
Sounds like a good project for some teenagers to make some money.
Yeah, what?
Goat and sheep.
Exactly.
Do you find you have to swath most of the field with thistles, or is it just patches you're talking?
It'd just be patches, probably. Yeah, it's going to depend on the year and on the field. And if this field, like if we had it grazed earlier, like say even 2 weeks earlier, I don't think those thistles would have gone to, the cows would have clipped them off because they would have been tender and they would have clipped them off. This year we had some wild oats in our red clover, and in 2 days the cows had like 25 acres just clipped, they stripped the wild oats right there. So there's certainly advantages from a weed control aspect.
Would you consider
With the animals.
swapping a PO mix to manage the timing as a swap graze, even in season, just to deal with that lack of flexibility of PO mix?
Could do that, yeah. Like, did everybody hear the question? Would I consider swapping a PO mix? And we would. The other thing you could do, and I know this is more an organic thing, some guys think you're crazy, but you could just go out and mow that and just leave that as a mulch, and then have whatever, say your vetch and your ryegrass could come up through that for fall. So there's different ways of managing that. And in the future, just a couple other things to maybe look at. Looking at some research that Clayton Robbins, and a few of you guys know who he is. He worked for Ag Canada in Brandon for years, and he's been looking at dense energy forages. He did a Nuffield scholarship a couple of years ago, and looking at, for sure, ryegrass. And if you look at the numbers here, the crude protein in that ryegrass is 18%, and if you look at oats and barley grain is 13%. The TDN, or total digestible nutrients, it's 78, and oats are 77. So, and the energy is also up too. And that's one of the biggest things with forages, is to get that energy to get your animals to gain. So, so those are the things that I think that we also, as Joanne had the slide of different things to look at for green manure. So if you want to graze them, here's a couple other things that we should maybe be looking at and focusing on if we want to get our rate of gains up. And a couple other things that he's found through his research is if you can graze when the plant moisture is below 80%, and we found this in the summer too, like we have really lush pastures in July, but we don't always get the pounds per day that we think we should. Like we'll be getting, instead of in July, we'll get like 1.5 pounds gain a day, and then in September, when things you think are dying off, well then we'll get, like we've had 3 pounds a day in our yearling steers. So, and I think part of it has to do with that moisture. So if you are anytime you're grazing these plants and they're really moist, you may need a supplemental dry hay or something that the animals can go to so their rumen's not full of just moisture. Other thing that they've looked at is the sugar protein ratio, and this would be the sugar would be a water soluble carbohydrate. It needs to be 2 to 3 to 1 as a ratio. So if your sugar is 20, you'd want your protein at 10, or that kind of a ratio. And also he's saying look for plants that'll put sugars into the soil, which is what we were talking about this morning. Is there plants out there that'll put more into their roots and exude more sugars and more carbon. For this year, we're looking at either a barley oat and a faba bean cover crop, and then hairy vetch and ryegrass. And chicory is a noxious weed, or it's a class 2 noxious weed. So that when they started working with it, they thought that it wouldn't overwinter, and now they're starting to find that it does. So I'm not sure at this point we've got enough weed challenges on our organic farm, whether I want to add one more that I'm not sure about. So we'll maybe let Joanne and Martin do some research on that and see if they either they pollute Carmen or Glenlee, or they don't, and then maybe we'll know if we want to go that road or not. This was another interesting quote that Clayton gave me the other day, and he'd been down speaking in North Dakota, and this is anecdotal so far, but they're starting to see that soil health changes that happen in 20 years with zero till, if you add cover crops into that mix, you can do it in 10 years, and then if you add grazing into those cover crops, and I didn't put that on the slide, it takes it down to 4 years. So those soil changes in organic matter and fertility and nitrogen. So it's going to be interesting to see if that plays out. If it does, that's going to be wonderful for this whole system. It'll really bring livestock back into the fore. And they are starting to do research in the States on that. It's just, at this point, he didn't know of any actually published research. So, but that's something to look at for the future. So, anyway, that's about all I have to talk about, I think. So is there any questions or for either myself or Joanne? Thank you very much.
Question? Any thoughts on using a turnip or a radish in your rotation at all?
Yeah, that's certainly another thing. We actually did radishes a few years ago, and that was one where we actually seeded it in August, which in our climate doesn't work because there's not enough growing days after that. So, but I know, actually Ryan Boyd's sitting just in front of you. He's got more experience with radish. Ryan, put up your hand. I think there's probably lots more knowledge in this room than what I've given you today. So make sure you network, and we'll go Dan at the back.
What have you noticed for yield from the crop swallowing? Did you notice any changes?
I don't have a lot of data because we've only done it a couple times. So yeah, I don't have a lot of great yield data. So I mean the wheat wasn't good, but I think we're also dealing with phosphorus challenges. We've been working with Martin and Joanne, and that's one of the things. So yeah, just I can't say right now that my yields are off the map. That's for sure. So yeah, actually our yields have actually dropped in organic. So since we started, so we're trying to figure that one out. So, anyway, another question here.
You made a comment about feeding dry hay when your cover crop was maybe on the wet side. I assume you tried that in the past?
Yeah, like we did. We actually did some of that this summer with our feeders, and it did help. We got better gains this summer in that July period than we had the previous couple of years.
And you found that they were still spending most of their time eating cover crop? And
Oh yeah, that wasn't on cover crop. That was just on perennial forage. But yeah, we did find that they're going to spend most of their time on that. But yeah, they will. And I mean, and the other thing is if you've let stuff grow up from the fall before, so you've got some dry matter down in the understory, there's stuff there that they can graze as well. Derek.
You made a good point about the sugar to protein ratio for optimum feed quality. Do you think, maybe you mentioned this, is there room then to play around with the oat to feed ratio if you want to get that nitrogen for the following crop, but you want to have a nice carbon to nitrogen in the feed? Yeah,
well, yeah, I think that's part of the, and I guess I didn't really go into that about what, and I'm not really sure what ratios of the, like say the vetch to the oats to the ryegrass should actually be. I'm not the best one to ask on those, but for sure, yeah, that's going to make a difference.
Any fava beans yet?
Pasture fava beans yet? No. That was a recommendation that Clayton's doing, and I mean, and they are. They've got some pretty good nitrogen fixing capabilities, and I'm not sure. And what he actually did this year, he went and cut his barley fava beans and silaged them and left them on the field. So then in the fall, he had the ryegrass come back, and then he let them into a bale or two a day as well. So, and he was getting, I think this year he said he got 800 pounds an acre gain. So if you were getting that, you actually wouldn't care how much you paid the neighbor to use his field. So.
You mentioned look for plants that will put sugars into the soil. Which plants are you thinking of, and how would you know?
That's the part of looking into the future, and yeah, I don't want to say on that. There's lots of other plant scientists here that you could probably grab that would be better to answer that question for sure. Kathleen, did you?
When you say you're graze out, you wanna graze when it's less than 80% plant moisture?
Mhm.
What kind of moisture is it normally when you're?
Well, I'm not 100% sure, but that's some of the data, and I think that was one of the researchers from either Brazil or Argentina, and that's what they found is, yeah, if you're grazing, say at 90%, and so one of the ways that you can deal with that, and it also deals with the sugar issues, if you go in, when you move them paddock to paddock, if you go in at the end of the day, when there's gonna be more sugars, and probably in our climate, when it's hotter during the day, yeah, so it's gonna be less moisture, putting the cows on a new paddock at 4, 6 in the afternoon versus going in at 6 in the morning.